My husband drowned 8 months ago. Last Sunday I sat 2 rows behind him at church. I know how that sounds. I know what people say about grief, how it bends the mind, how it fills empty rooms with shadows that look like the people we lost. I believed all of that. For 8 months I believed it completely. Until the moment I did not. It was the first Sunday in October. The kind of morning that makes you think God is showing off. All gold, light, and cool air and leaves turning colors just for the pleasure of it. I had been attending the 11 o'clock service at Calvary Methodist since Frank died. Not because my faith had grown stronger, but because sitting in a pew surrounded by people who did not look at me with sad eyes was the closest thing to rest I had found. At home there was only quiet. At church there was at least music. I arrived late. I always arrived late those days because getting dressed had become a complicated negotiation between who I used to be and who I was now. I slipped into a pew near the back, nodded at the woman beside me, and opened my bulletin without looking up. The choir was already moving through the second verse of How Great Thou Art. That was when I heard him clear his throat. It is a sound so small that most people would not notice it. But you spend 37 years beside a man, you memorize him the way you memorize your own address, without trying, without meaning to. 2 short clears, then a pause, then one more. Frank's signature, the way he always settled into a seat in a movie theater, at a restaurant, at the doctor's office. 2 short, 1 long. I used to tease him about it. My head came up slowly. 2 rows ahead, slightly to the left, a man sat with his shoulders squared, wearing a gray sport coat I did not recognize. Silver hair, close cut, the back of his neck lined with the kind of creases that come from a life spent outdoors. His right hand rested on the pew beside him. And there, along the inside of his forearm where the sleeve had ridden up an inch, was the edge of an anchor tattoo in dark blue ink. Frank had gotten that tattoo for our 25th wedding anniversary. He had never been in the Navy. He just loved the sea, and he wanted something permanent to mark the year he said was the best of his life. The tattoo artist had incorporated the date into the rope winding around the anchor, a date only I knew the meaning of. I stopped breathing. The choir kept singing. The congregation kept swaying. Around me the world moved forward without asking my permission. I leaned to the left, trying to see his face from the side. He was looking straight ahead at the altar. His jaw was the same, slightly square, the ear the same shape. When he turned his head briefly to glance at the program, I saw it. The small scar below his left ear where he had caught a fishhook at 14, and his father had pulled it out with pliers rather than pay for an emergency room. The bulletin in my hands made a sharp crinkling sound. The woman beside me glanced over. "Are you all right?" she whispered. I could not answer her. When the congregation stood for the closing hymn, I stood too. I watched the man rise ahead of me, taller than average. A slight favoring of the left hip when he stood. The old fishing injury that had bothered him since his 40s. He turned to speak to the woman beside him, and I saw his face fully for the first time. It was Frank, thinner, maybe. Something different about the set of his expression, guarded in a way he never used to be. But the face was the face I had kissed good morning for 37 years. The nose that had been broken once in a softball game and never sat quite straight afterward, the deep-set eyes, the particular brown of creek water in autumn. My legs were moving before I had made any decision to move them. I pushed gently through the closing crowd, keeping my eyes on the gray sport coat. He was making his way toward the side aisle with the woman beside him, her hand loose in the crook of his elbow. She was perhaps 10 years younger than me, soft-faced, wearing a yellow cardigan. They moved with the ease of people who had sat in this church many Sundays, who knew which door led out to the parking lot fastest. "Frank." My voice came out quieter than I intended. He did not stop. "Frank, I said again, louder. He stopped. His shoulders pulled back in a way I recognized. Then he turned. When his eyes found me, something moved across his face that was not confusion. It was faster than that. Sharper. A split-second calculation. Then the expression smoothed over into polite blankness. "I am sorry," he said. "I think you may have me mixed up with someone else." His voice. Exactly his voice. The slight flatness on certain vowels that came from growing up in eastern Ohio. I stepped closer. "My name is Beverly Callahan," I said. "And your name is Frank Callahan. We were married in this county 37 years ago. You drowned in Lake Erie 8 months ago. Except here you are." The woman in the yellow cardigan put her hand on his arm. He shook his head slowly. "My name is Raymond Voss," he said. "I have never seen you before." "Show me your arm," I said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. Your left forearm." "Show it to me." He glanced at the woman. Then, slowly, he pulled back his sleeve. The anchor was there in full. The rope wound around it, and at the base of the rope, woven into the design, the numbers of our anniversary. I pointed. "June 14th, 1987, I said. "That is what those numbers are. That is the date of our wedding. You told the artist it was a lucky number. You never told anyone what it actually meant." A muscle in his jaw moved. "I am going to ask you to leave," he said quietly. "I want to hear you say it," I said. His eyes held mine for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away. "We need to go," he said to the woman. And they walked out. I stood in the emptying church while an usher collected the remaining bulletins and someone straightened the candles at the altar. My hands were shaking, but my mind had gone very still. The kind of still that comes not from calm, but from the moment before something enormous shifts. I got to my car and sat for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Then I took out my phone and called my daughter. Renee answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay? I need to see you today." "I can come by this afternoon," she said. "What's wrong? You sound strange." "I will tell you when you get here." She arrived at 3. I watched her come up the front walk. My daughter at 35. Her father's walk exactly. That same slight forward lean, like she was always moving toward something just ahead. She let herself in with her key and found me at the kitchen table with Frank's old photo albums open in front of me. She sat down. "What is all this?" I told her what happened at the church. I told her calmly, without crying. Because somewhere between the parking lot and home, I had moved past the part where tears were useful. I told her about the throat clearing, the tattoo, the numbers, the scar. I watched her face the whole time. That was my mistake. And also my advantage. Because Renee had her father's face, and I knew every shift of it. When I described the moment, I pointed to the tattoo and said the date of our wedding. A brief change moved through my daughter's expression. Not surprise. Something more like dread. She covered it quickly. But I had been a nurse for 30 years. I had watched people's faces in difficult moments for longer than that. I did not miss it. "Mom," she said gently when I finished, "grief can do things to us. It can make us see what we desperately want to see." I heard his voice. "Renee, I saw the tattoo. There are people who look alike in this world," she said. "There could be an explanation." "Did you know?" I asked. The question sat between us. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "I know this has been the hardest year of your life," she said. "We buried a closed casket," I said. "Because the water—" "Mom," the coroner said. "We never saw his body." Her hand tightened on mine. "Mom, I am going back to that church next Sunday," I said, "and the Sunday after that, until I find out who that man is." She looked at me for a long moment. "Let me come with you," she said, finally. I noticed she did not say I was wrong. I did not wait until Sunday. Tuesday morning, I drove back to Calvary Methodist and spoke with the church secretary, a small, energetic woman named Gloria, who had attended the congregation for 40 years and knew every member by name and prayer request. I described the man in the gray sport coat. "Raymond and Helen Voss," Gloria said without hesitation. "They joined us about 6 months ago. Lovely couple. He does something in commercial real estate, I believe. They live out on the east side, one of those newer developments off Route 14. I thanked her. That evening, I drove out to Route 14 and turned into a development called Birchwood Estates. I moved slowly through the streets until I saw a white SUV I had not recognized from the church, but felt I should note. Then, 2 more turns in, a gray sedan in a driveway, and at the front door of a tan colonial with black shutters, a hanging basket of chrysanthemums. The orange and yellow kind Frank always said were the most honest flowers, because they bloomed when everything else was dying. I parked at the end of the block. 15 minutes later, the front door opened and he came out. He was wearing old jeans and a flannel shirt and carrying a bag of trash toward the cans at the curb. Ordinary, casual. The ease of a man in a life that belongs to him. He lifted the lid and set the bag inside and stood there a moment, his hand resting on the can, looking up at the sky the way he used to when he was checking whether rain was coming. Then he went back inside. I drove home. I did not sleep that night either. I lay in the dark. And I thought about the closed casket and the coroner's report that no one had questioned because why would we? I thought about the life insurance, $240,000, that had paid out 7 weeks after the funeral. I thought about Frank's business partner, Dennis, who had retired to Florida the month after Frank died, which I had thought was grief but which I now thought about differently. I thought about every conversation in the last 2 years of our marriage that I had told myself was distance born of age and routine, but which now felt like something being managed, something being prepared. At 4 in the morning, I sat up and turned on the light. Frank had been afraid of drowning. That was the detail that had bothered me for 8 months like a splinter I could not locate. He grew up on Lake Erie, yes. He loved to fish, but he had never learned to swim. Not properly, and he wore his life vest on the water with a consistency that friends teased him about. When the boat was found overturned and he was not, the Coast Guard had said the vest was missing too, that the water that day was rough, that it happened. I had accepted all of it because you accept what you are told when grief has made you soft in the knees. On Wednesday morning, I drove downtown and found a private investigator. His name was Garrett, late 50s. The kind of careful quietness that suggested he had seen most things. I told him everything, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman presenting facts. The church, the tattoo, the date, the scar, the address. He listened without interrupting. "This is not the first time I have heard this kind of story," he said when I finished. "But I want to be honest with you. If this is real, it is complicated. We are talking about insurance fraud, possibly identity fraud, forged death certificates." "I know what we are talking about," I said. "What do you need from me?" "Time," he said. "Money, and everything you have in writing about the original death report." I paid him. I went home and pulled out every document from the folder labeled Frank Estate that I had not opened in 4 months, because opening it felt like giving the loss a second life. On Friday, Renee called to check on me. I kept my voice steady. I told her I was doing better. I asked her how work was going, how the kids were, normal things. She sounded relieved. I set the phone down and made a note. Garrett called me the following Thursday. "I have enough to begin," he said. "Can you come in?" The folder he showed me was not thick yet, but what was inside it was enough. A property record showing that Raymond Thomas Voss had purchased the tan colonial on Birchwood Estates 11 months ago, 2 months before Frank Callahan of Lakeview, Ohio, disappeared from a boat on Lake Erie. The Social Security number attached to Raymond Voss had been issued in 1961 to a deceased infant in Pennsylvania. A birth certificate that had been applied for 6 years prior through a process Garrett described in terms I recognized from the insurance work Frank had done for 30 years. He had known exactly how these systems worked. And then the bank records. 14 months before the accident, a series of transfers from the joint account Frank and I had held for 3 decades. Small amounts first, irregular, the kind that would not trigger automatic flags. Then larger. Over the course of a year, $212,000 had moved through 3 accounts and come to rest somewhere Garrett had not yet fully traced. He had been building a life before he ended ours. I closed the folder and asked Garrett how long it would take to get the rest. "Give me 2 more weeks," he said. I drove to Renee's house that evening. I did not call ahead. When she answered the door, she looked surprised and then, reading something in my face, uneasy. "Come in," she said. We sat in her living room. Her husband was not home. The kids were upstairs doing homework. She made coffee and set a mug in front of me and wrapped both hands around her own, the way she used to when she was a teenager, sitting at my kitchen table with something difficult to say. "I need you to tell me what you know," I said. She did not pretend not to understand. She cried before she spoke. Long enough that I sat with my coffee going cold and waited. I had time. I had learned to wait. "He called me 18 months ago," she said finally. "He said that he and you had grown apart, that he had been unhappy for a long time, that he had met someone." I nodded. "He asked me not to tell you," she continued. "He said he was going to fix things, that it was complicated. He said the business was in trouble and if he just walked away you would both lose everything. And you believed him." She wiped her face. "He was my father, and he said he would handle it, that he would find a way to leave that was fair to you. Instead, he died." She pressed her lips together. "When the accident happened, I told myself it must have been guilt, that maybe he had gone out on the water that day to think, and the storm came up, and she stopped." Her voice dropped. "And then the insurance paid out. The insurance he had doubled the year before without mentioning it to me," I said. She closed her eyes. "Were you there, Renee? Did you know before the accident what he was planning?" A long silence. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Upstairs, one of the kids laughed at something. "He told me 2 weeks before," she whispered, "that there was going to be an accident, that it would look real, that you would be taken care of. He said it was the only way. You let me bury a stranger," I said. She broke apart then, completely. I watched my daughter grieve the thing she had done, and I felt something I could not name, not rage, not love, something older and more finished than either. I stood up. "I'm going to leave now," I said. "You should call a lawyer in the morning, before someone else calls you." She looked up at me, red-eyed. "Mom, please, I love you," I told her. "But love does not make this smaller than it is." I walked out. The next morning I called my own attorney, a woman named Patricia who handled estate law but knew immediately that what I needed was a step beyond her. She referred me to a colleague who dealt in financial fraud and identity crimes. His name was Howard. And when I laid the documents on his desk, he leaned forward with the particular alertness of a man who had been waiting for a case worth his full attention. "What you have here is the beginning of an airtight case," he said. "Insurance fraud, identity fraud, fraudulent death reporting, financial theft from a joint marital estate. With your daughter's testimony and these bank records, the district attorney will have no choice but to act." "A confession would help," I said. "Documented." Can you get one? I thought of Renee, shattered in her own living room. I thought of Frank, standing at the trash can in the morning light, looking up at his borrowed sky. I can try. I called Renee that evening and told her I had thought it over, that I was not ready to lose her on top of everything else, that I wanted to understand, fully, so that I could begin to move forward. I heard the relief in her voice, the terrible hope of it. Can we meet? I asked. She suggested her house. I suggested mine. My kitchen, where I had the most control. She came the next afternoon and talked for 2 hours. She told me everything. The contact she had maintained with her father after the accident, the monthly calls, the story he had given her about building a new life, the promise that he would eventually send money through channels that would look like investments. She told me about the man he had paid, a distant acquaintance with a terminal diagnosis, and a family in need who had agreed to spend his last weeks under Frank's name in a hospice facility 2 hours away. She told me how her father had stood at his own funeral. I let her talk. I asked quiet questions. I kept my hands still in my lap. The recorder in my cardigan pocket ran for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Howard filed the complaint on a Thursday. By Friday evening, 2 things happened. The district attorney's office confirmed they were opening a formal investigation. And Frank Callahan, living as Raymond Thomas Voss of Birchwood Estates, was contacted by investigators for the first time. I found out what happened next from Garrett, who had maintained a quiet watch on the neighborhood. Frank had come out of the house with a bag, had put it in the trunk of the gray sedan. Helen Voss, the woman in the yellow cardigan, had come to the door and they had exchanged words that Garrett could not hear but could read. She was pointing. He was shaking his head. She went back inside and he sat in the car for 20 minutes without starting it. Then he drove away. He came to my house. I did not know it was him until I heard the knock. 3 times, a pause, twice more. His knock. The one that used to mean he had his hands full and needed me to open the door. Old habits are the last things to die. I opened the door. He stood on my porch for the first time in 8 months. He looked smaller than I had remembered him. Or maybe I had grown. Beverly, he said. I did not move to let him in. I am listening, I said. He spoke for a long time. He spoke about loneliness and fear and the feeling of having built a life that did not fit him anymore and not knowing how to say so. He spoke about Helen as though the explanation would soften something. He told me he was sorry, more than once, in ways that were probably sincere and were also, at that point, beside the purpose. When he finished, I said, "The investigators have been contacted. Your assets under the Raymond Voss identity have been frozen. Howard Fielding is my attorney. You should call yours." He stared at me. "You already, Beverly. If we could just—" "You made a choice," I said. "You chose this path over 37 years of a life we built together. You involved my daughter. You let me grieve." He looked at my face and whatever he was searching for, he did not find it. I closed the door. I stood in my entry hall and listened to him walk back to his car. I listened to the engine start. I listened to the sound of the life he had tried to build for himself. Drive away from my curb for the last time. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The fraudulent death certificate, issued through a county clerk who had since retired, was flagged within the first 2 weeks. The man who had died under Frank's name was identified through dental records, his family notified, his real death properly recorded. The money was traced through the 3 accounts to a 4th, from which Frank had drawn a modest salary as Raymond Voss for 8 months. Most of it was still there. The life insurance company filed a civil claim. The district attorney filed criminal charges. Frank Callahan, who had never become Raymond Voss in any legal sense, was formally charged with insurance fraud, identity fraud, filing a false death report, and theft from a marital estate. Renee entered into a cooperation agreement. She received probation and community service, and the kind of consequence that would live in her longer than any sentence. We did not speak for 4 months. The day I received word that a plea agreement had been reached and Frank would serve time in a federal facility, I drove out to the cemetery where the stranger lay beneath my husband's name. I had arranged for the headstone to be changed. A work order was pending. The man's real name would eventually mark the place where he actually rested. I stood there a few minutes. The October light was doing the same thing it always did, coming in sideways and making everything look more significant than it was. I was not there to mourn. I was there to close a door. On the drive home, I stopped at the Methodist church and sat in the parking lot for a while. Inside, someone was practicing the organ, running the same phrase over and over, getting it right. I sat and listened through the car window. I had given 37 years of my life to a man who had spent the last 2 of them calculating how to erase me. That was the truth, and no amount of grief or anger or legal resolution was going to make it smaller or more bearable. What I had learned was that it did not need to be bearable. It needed to be true. And once the truth was no longer mine alone, once it had been documented and witnessed and carried by the law, something shifted in me that I had not expected. I felt light, not happy, not healed, but unencumbered. The way you feel when you finally set down something heavy you had been carrying for so long, you stopped noticing the weight. The weeks after that were quieter. I cleaned out the closet where his things had stayed, not because I was erasing him, but because I needed the space. I called an old friend I had fallen out of touch with and made plans to visit her in Savannah. I signed up for a watercolor class on Wednesday mornings at the community center, something I had always wanted and always deferred to things that seemed more important. Renee came to see me in December. She stood at the door the way she had as a girl when she had done something she knew was wrong and had worked up the courage to face it anyway. I let her in. We did not resolve everything. You do not resolve 37 years of one truth and 8 months of another over coffee at the kitchen table. But we talked. We talked for a long time, and when she left, she hugged me at the door, and I held on a moment longer than I had planned. I am not the woman who stood in that church pew and stopped breathing. I am not the woman who sat in her car outside a stranger's church and wept into her steering wheel. I am someone who decided, at 64 years old, in the ruins of a marriage she had believed in completely, that the rest of her life was still hers to claim. Not because I was strong. I was not always strong. I fell apart quietly, alone, in ways I will probably never describe to anyone, but I made one choice. Then another. Then another. I chose to follow the truth instead of the comfortable story. I chose strategy over tears when both were available. I chose myself when I had spent 37 years choosing someone else. No one gives you that choice. No one hands it to you. You find it when you have run out of everything else. And you take it, and you do not let go. That is the only kind of strength that matters.